Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, sehr herzlich willkommen einmal mehr an diesem von der Brise geschüttelten, brillanten Frühjahrstag. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass Sie nach dem Auftritt von Frau Strack-Zimmermann wiederum sehr zahlreich hier bei uns erschienen sind. Bei uns, das heißt beim Schweizerischen Institut für Auslandforschung an der Universität Zürich. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. We are very pleased to greet all of you at Zurich University in the name of the Swiss Institute of International Studies, and an especially warm welcome, of course, goes to our distinguished guest and speaker, Ayelet Gundar-Goshen. Dear Ayelet, we are honored and pleased to have you here with us. It's absolutely tremendous that you made a trip from Israel here to Zurich, and we are glad to hear you in a minute. Thank you. This is a sort of sign of Swiss hospitality. It will continue at the end. It will raise also to other levels. Tonight's topic, ladies and gentlemen, guilty pleasures, the fundamental role of guilt on our lives. Well, this is indeed a vast field, and of course not only for philosophers and psychologists, but evidently also for our daily life. Is it then possible at all not to feel guilty, since we, each of us, entered or were made to enter a planet called life? Guilt towards others, towards God, if He exists, towards a country, a nation, a people, towards ourselves, seemingly an endless challenge, and mostly with most uncertain results. Interesting, of course, is the link which Ayelet Gundar-Goshen draws, namely the connection to and with pleasure. I have no idea yet how this should function and work, and especially in this city where Zwingli, a radical reformer at the end of the Middle Ages, abolished also the possibility of confession and therefore of redemption. Guilt is still a given which lasts and lasts and lasts. But let's see how Ayelet will manage, maybe even to promote and seek more actions of guilt for the benefit of the pleasures which go with them. Born in 1982, Ayelet Gundar-Goshen studied psychology in Tel Aviv and later cinema and screenplay in Jerusalem. She worked and works as a journalist and teaches at several universities, for example, the distinguished University of California in Los Angeles. Soon, she also started to write short stories and screenplays and made her first movies. In 2013, she published her first novel, One Night Markowitz, which immediately won important prizes. 2 years later followed the next novel, Waking Lines, and in 2021 she published also the absolutely fascinating novel, I quote the German title, Wo der Wolf lauert. Ayelet's books are translated also, of course, in German, and published by the Zurich and Berlin located publishing house of Kain and Aber. Dear Ayelet, thanks again. We cannot wait to become guilty by and with your wise Prizes. And one additional word, after the lecture, Ayan will sign her books, which are here presented by the famous bookshop of Mr. Reimann at the Hirslanden bookshop. I hope this was enough promotion. Ayan, the floor is yours.
Tov, shalom, and good evening. And thank you for inviting me here today to talk about two things that people usually don't like to talk about, at least not publicly, which is guilt and pleasure. Our guilt and our pleasures are issues that most people prefer to leave hidden. We like to do it, but we don't do it with other people, usually. And as an author and also as a psychologist, I find those topics that people usually rather not talk about to be the topics that we have to talk about and to write about, the most interesting topics of all. So guilt arises when we do whatever it is that we're not supposed to do, feel what we're not supposed to feel, think what we're not supposed to think. It's a very private and intimate emotion, but at the same time, it's one of the core elements of our social existence. And it has many aspects, but I think the one I will want to focus on today is this core sentence that I think captures the essence of what guilt is all about. And the sentence is, I'm not supposed to do this. I think this sentence is like the essence of guilt. It's a negation sentence, the not supposed. And it automatically makes us feel uncomfortable, right? We can almost hear the mother or father or grandmother scolding us, right? You're not supposed to do this. What kind of boy are you? But, say it again. I'm not supposed to do this. I'm really not supposed to do this. Do you feel something tempting here as well? Like a hidden promise or a siren calling? I think what's interesting about the sentence is that while at first it seems like a very straightforward communication with a very crystal clear meaning, there is something quite ambiguous about it. This sentence tells us one thing, but it makes us desire exactly the opposite. The more, if you go on a train and you hear somebody saying, I'm really not supposed to do this, what are you thinking about? What is this? You automatically have this desire to know what this is. And I think as we try to map this place that guilt holds in our life, we gradually realize that guilt is not just a barrier that stops us from seeking forbidden pleasures. Guilt is strongly connected to pleasure, and in certain times, it can be pleasure itself. So I'll talk a bit about guilt in literature and in everyday life, in psychology, in international affairs. But before I do that, I want to take a moment and ask you to recall the physical sensation of guilt. Where is it physically? Now, nothing is easier than sitting in a beautiful hall, listening to somebody else talking about guilt. So I want to ask you for a moment to try and recall a moment in your life as children, we go to the safe areas, as children, when you felt guilty. The physical sensation, okay? You did something wrong, you got caught or you didn't. Try to revive the moment. And I think it's interesting because we usually try to leave those moments locked outside. And now we're trying to invite them into this hall so that each person here has the guilty child who did something wrong sitting on his lap or on the chair next to him. And what's interesting for me is that when I recall those memories in my own childhood, they come with really a physical sensation. They're registered. Like guilt is not just written in books, right? It's written on our skin. We have a very physical sensation of it. And we're willing to go very, very far to avoid this specific physical sensation. And when we ask ourselves about the genesis of guilt, I think a good place to start would be the book of Genesis. I always go back to the book of Genesis because it's the myth of creation. You start from nothing. So you have this question of, if I write a myth from nothing about creation, when will guilt first appear? From the moment when is created until the moment we have guilt as part of man's life. So God creates man, and man is first free of guilt, like a newborn child. And then Adam eats the apple. But is it really the apple that Adam desires? Of course not, right? The garden is full of fruits. He wants the one fruit that he is not supposed to eat. So we can see how from the very beginning, you're not supposed to do this leads to a desire to do exactly this. This is the primal sin. This is the primal guilt. And it appears right after man is created, as if the Bible wanted to tell us that for mankind, pleasure and guilt come hand in hand from the first moment. And in ancient times, the church offered a certificate to people to get rid of the guilt, right? You could pay a certain amount of money, and you got a certificate from the church saying that you're forgiven for the primal sin and from your own guilt. So it's quite interesting to see how fast guilt became a business, right? Guilt was traded for gold. At the same time, in every household, we saw parents using guilt to educate their children. You're not supposed to do this. What kind of boy are you? And I think what's interesting, for me at least as a psychologist, is that as a child grows up, we see how the guilt, you're not supposed to do this, is internalized, so that we no longer need the parent to tell us, I'm very disappointed. The guilt is inside of us now. We are disappointed from ourselves. And the things we do to avoid this disappointment, the things we do to avoid the guilt feelings of, I'm not supposed to do this, I was supposed to be better, I'm not good enough. We build castles, we write PhDs, some of us write novels, because guilt is the ultimate fuel. It's a very powerful driving fuel. It's also referred by Freud as the whip with which society hits us on the back, like a leash, in order to make sure that we stay right on track. And he described this tyrant force of guilt like a power that stops us from following our aggressive needs or sexual needs, like the glue that keeps society together. Think if I kicked out the guilty child that we just entered the hall. Think if we kicked out the children and we took guilt away from everyone sitting here. If I had like a superpower to take the guilt away from everyone sitting here, would you want to be locked in this hall for more than 2 minutes? So it's a very powerful social power, but as every power, power comes with a price. And the price we're talking about is the repression of our instincts. It's living a false life which are controlled by guilt rather than by passion. Decisions that we made, how many big decisions in our life are motivated by the fear of feeling guilty? How many decisions in our life are motivated by the need to be happy? And if you look at the end of the 19th century, where Freud grew up, you really see a good example of this false life brought to you by guilt. Because back then, society suffered from an overdose of guilt feelings. So if you were a woman back then, you felt guilty if you had sex. You felt guilty if you thought about having sex. You felt guilty if you had sex with yourself. Guilt was all over the place, right? It was like a perfume sprayed around everyone. And as a therapist in modern days, I quite often feel that my job is to take some of the burden of guilt from a patient's shoulders. For example, a depressed mother who hates herself for being so bored with her newborn. Now, being bored, being stuck with a baby all day, this is totally normal, okay? This is okay. What she can't face is how much she hates herself for feeling this way, because she's not supposed to feel this. As a mother, she's not supposed to get bored from sitting home all day with a child. Or an Orthodox guy wants to kill himself because he's feeling that he's not supposed to be attracted to men. He's supposed to be attracted to women, and he's not attracted to women, so he wants to kill himself. And I find it quite often in therapy that our job is to free people from this burden of guilt and to accept their inner world without so much judgment. So we said that the guilt era dominated Vienna of the 19th century. And then we really had this guilt strangling people's individual needs. And psychoanalysis offered some sort of emancipation from guilt in this aspect. But if I ask you about modern days, let's go back from Vienna to these days, what would you say is the main social problem of our times? Is it over-restriction of individual needs and feelings, or quite the opposite? Is it over-glorification of the individual and lack of guilt and shame? So 100 years ago, people used to go to church to confess their sins. These days, most people I know don't go to church. We shifted from these wooden benches of the church to the comfortable couches of the clinics. And people still come with their guilt, and guilt back then was traded for gold. Right now, guilt is traded for about 100 euros. I don't know, how is it in Swiss? Tel Aviv, 100 euros for a set. Yeah? But in Israel, the price is you go to Tel Aviv, you pay 100 euros, 50 minutes on the couch, you go outside, ceremony is over, patient goes back to his life, purified of guilt. But you could ask, what is it that we're purified of when we leave the church back then or the clinic right now? Are we purified from the sin, from the wrongdoings we committed? Or are we purified just from feeling guilty about it? Do we intend to act different from now on, or just to feel different about our actions? I was occupied with these questions when I sat down to write Liar. It's a novel I wrote about an Israeli ice cream seller who turns into a sort of Cinderella because she files a complaint about a sexual assault that never happens. And the novel was inspired by a real event that happened in Israel, where a woman made up a story about a sexual assault and ended up confessing that it was a lie. And in Israel, everyone automatically turned against this woman. They called her a monster, and the main word used was a psychopath. And the word psychopath, in clinical term, is antisocial behavior. Refers to people incapable of guilt feelings. But when I wrote The Liar, it was very important for me that the character will be presented not as a psychopath, but as a woman who is perfectly capable of guilt feelings. Because I think when you say no guilt feelings, it's not just a moral deficit. It's also a literary deficit. A character without guilt feelings is a character without inner conflict. She's not interesting dramatically. She can be a source of adrenaline, okay? But she's not interesting dramatically. So HBO and Netflix might disagree here. And TV is full of psychopaths, right? People who are incapable of guilt, and we watch them like this. But I think it's more about the adrenaline. It's more about how many women is he going to slaughter inside this little dungeon before he gets caught. It's not about a drama. The dramatic tension is zero. Because dramatic tension is a result of internal conflict, the clash between our moral code and society's demand, between our passion and our morals. For example, you can write a story about a man trying to kill a dinosaur. It can be full of twists and turns. It would be very interesting, but it wouldn't be a drama. But if I told you I'm writing a story about a young man whose father wants him to kill a dinosaur, his father really wants him to kill a dinosaur, his father's family heritage, but he himself doesn't want to kill the dinosaur, and he's torn from within, okay? Then we have a drama, because we have an inner conflict between expectations, between needs. And according to Sartre, when we talk about guilt, we talk about the byproduct of choice. For those of us who acknowledge the full responsibility we have over our choices, guilt is inevitable. That's why I think it's like the oxygen of literature, of real literature, not dinosaurs. Can you imagine Raskolnikov, Anna Karenina, Thomas Buddenbrook, Macbeth, without their guilt? Without this constant conflict between their individual passion and the social norms? Even characters who seem to be completely incapable of guilt, think about Humbert in Lolita, are still defined by guilt. It's the lack of guilt that makes them so interesting. So even if they don't have it, guilt is what draws us into this novel. We want to read about someone who doesn't have it because we are so controlled by it all the time. So if I go back to The Liar, when I thought about this character with the false complaint, I asked myself, what happens to a girl who is not a psychopath that gets tangled up in such a lie? And she feels guilty about the lie, but she dreads this guilt feeling because she knows that if she just feels guilty enough, she will have to act about it, she will have to confess. Because guilt leads us to take responsibility over our actions. So this girl's guilt is like, I thought of it like a Persian cat. It comes, it sits on your lap, you pat it a bit, and then you push it away. She doesn't want her guilt to stay for too long because she doesn't want to pay the price. And here we can stop and ask, but wait, does feeling guilty necessarily means paying a price, taking responsibility? Melanie Klein, she's one of my favorite psychoanalysts, she saw guilt as a developmental achievement in the life of a child. She said that guilt drives us to try and repair what we damaged. It can be a vase or a relationship. I'm a mother of 3 young children, and it's amazing. I see the vase test as the ultimate test. The moment a child pushes the vase and it falls down and breaks, and he has this smile of, did you hear what amazing sound it makes when it clashes? And then there's the child that runs away as if he did nothing. The vase just fell because, gravity, it had nothing to do with him. And then there's the child that you come back home and you find him trying to put the pieces together, making an even more terrible mess. But that's a developmental achievement, right? To try and clean the mess, to take responsibility over the mess. We're not there yet. So this driving power of guilt, we don't just talk about Anna Karenina or Raskolnikov. We can talk about pop culture. If we think about every superhero that we know, Harry Potter, Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, what do they all have in common? They're all orphans. They're all alone in the world. They all have a terrible story about how they became orphans, and you could say that they're all driven by what we call survivor's guilt. My parents gave their life in order to save me. I wasn't supposed to be alive right now. I am not supposed to do this, that we have as the core sentence of guilt. I'm not supposed to be here. My father was supposed to be here. And because I'm not supposed to be here, this is the guilt. I have to redeem myself through my actions. I have to save the world to prove that they didn't give their lives for nothing. That's the depth of pop culture. But I think, for me, the most interesting question is, what happens when guilt becomes a substitute for action instead of a motivator? So, I feel guilty. I'm covered with guilt, like Lady Macbeth trying to wash the blood, the guilt from her hands. I'm covered in guilt. I indulge myself in guilt. But I have no intention to act about my guilt. The guilt becomes the action. I did something bad, so what do I do about it? I feel really bad about it. I feel really, really guilty. It doesn't drive me into action. It is action itself. So if they ask, what did you do about it? I say, I felt terrible. I really felt terrible. So my guilt feelings become, instead of something that motivates me to action, I use my guilt, I waive my guilt, as if it was an alibi to my moral character. I do something bad. I go to my therapist, or I go to my friends, and I tell them, wow, I felt so bad for doing this. I felt so guilty for doing this, but this is not a preparation for action. Feeling guilty makes me feel like, okay, I did something about it. I felt really bad about it, and now I can go back doing it again. So we can talk about two very different kinds of guilt. One is the guilt that Sartre talked about. Guilt is the byproduct of choice, of taking full responsibility over our actions. This I'd call creative guilt. We don't put the words guilt and creative together, right? But I think there is such thing as creative guilt. It's the guilt that drives us to create a change in the world. If I feel guilty in the national level for not doing anything at the time of the Shoah, at the time of the Holocaust, this guilt can drive me to take a stand the next time a nation or a group of people is attacked. It's creative guilt. It creates a change of the world. But guilt could just as well become a sort of moral masturbation. You sit alone in the room, you feel really guilty, but you don't act in the world, you don't interact with other people, you don't create, you don't conceive anything new with your guilt. And I think this kind of guilt we can call sedative guilt because it sedates something. Like, say an author comes to Zurich to give a talk, while her partner is babysitting 2 kids and 1 baby at the hotel. Fictional story. She finished the talk and goes drinking with a stranger, ending up in bed with him. And then she goes back to the hotel. The next day, she feels really guilty about it. This guilt is like a pleasure tax, which she happily pays because it helps her maintain her moral balance. So as a psychologist, when patients tell me that they feel really guilty about something, I try to identify what sort of guilt is it exactly. Is this person describing creative guilt? Is this guilt going to be a force that motivates him to try and repair, fix, change something in his own life or related to others? Or could it be that this person is practicing sedative guilt? He has no intention to change anything. He's simply paying his guilt tax. That comes along with his pleasure. Now, I have to say, guilt tax is not pleasant, right? We all hate paying taxes. But we do it because it keeps the system going. It keeps everything on balance. And I started asking myself, too, whenever I feel guilty in my everyday life, which is quite often, what am I doing right now with this guilt? What am I using my guilt for? Am I using it to change something? Or am I using it like a tax that can help me maintain doing whatever it is I'm already doing? So this exact question about guilt was in my mind when I was writing Waking Lions. The protagonist is an Israeli doctor, and he thinks of himself as a good man until he accidentally has a hit-and-run accident, and he's leaving the refugee, the Eritrean refugee that he hit on the side of the road. Now, of course, he's guilty from the legal aspect, but I was more interested in the psychological aspect of his guilt. And while I was writing this novel, I was very preoccupied with the way guilt develops among children, because my girl just had a brother, and she reached this phase when she would never hit him in front of me, but if I left the room for 2 minutes, then you would be from the living room, and I would come back and the baby would be crying. She would be on the other side of the room, but the baby would be crying. And I remember I thought, okay, she reached the first phase in her guilt development. She wouldn't do anything when she's being watched, but she doesn't have the internalized eyes of the mother inside of her. But if I do my job good enough, then within a few years, my mother passed away a year ago. She's not here, but I don't hit my 2 sisters anymore. And whenever I want to hit them, I tell myself, think what your mother would want you to do with them. Think how much your relationship was important to her. So even if she's not here physically, she's inside of me with the I'm not supposed to kill my sister. This is Cain and Abel. This is Cain and Abel, the basic story of guilt. And the idea that what is first a sign that the Father, God, gives the sign, the Cain sign, on the head of Cain. This is the guilt sign. It is first given by the parent, by the God, and it is later inside of us. Now, the doctor in Waking Lions, he had a good mother. He has the internalized parental eyes inside of him. So he's a moral contributing guy to society. He helps people, he saves lives, he's pro-refugees, who would sign a petition for the refugees. But what happens when no one is watching him? What happens if you hit someone in the middle of the night and your mother is not there and nobody is there? And even the internal eye blinks for a moment. What will we do when no one is watching? And when I kept on writing the novels, I knew that the core of the novel would be the Israeli doctor hitting the Eritrean refugee and leaving him on the side of the road. And I told it to my partner, the one with the 2 kids and the baby in the hotel right now. And he told me, it sounds good, but you can't stop here. You can't stop with a white guy killing a black guy, feeling really guilty about it in his decorated living room. Because it's just too easy. It's too convenient. You can sit in your living room and feel guilty. People do it all the time. It changes nothing. It has zero effect on reality. That's the sedative guilt I was talking about earlier. And this is how the character of the refugee's wife came into the novel. Because after this discussion, a bit of a fight that we had over this, I came up with the character of the refugee's wife. She's a woman, she was there, she saw it, and she's coming to the doctor, and she's forcing him to take his quite convenient guilt, the sedative guilt, and to transform it into creative guilt. She forces him to take responsibility. She starts blackmailing him to give medical treatment to other refugees. And I like the idea that in literature, sometimes you're thinking this internal conflict can be manifested through another character, which actually echoes the internal conflict of a person, but it's manifested in her. And Sirkit, the character of the refugee's wife, is the character that really forces him to take this convenient, sedative guilt and transform it into creative one. In my latest novel, Where the Wolf Lurks, there's an Israeli mother who starts to suspect that her own child was involved in the death of his classmate, a Muslim boy. And I wrote this novel after I became a mother, and I thought quite a lot as a mother, how would my protagonist react if she was to find out that the accusation was true, that her son was really guilty in the death of his classmate? What is her motherly duty? Is it to help him get away with it, because a mother must love her child above everything? Or is it to make him feel guilty enough to go and confess? And I don't know how is it today in Switzerland, but I can tell you that in Israel, parents are much more concerned today in raising children which usually when they talk with you about guilt, they're saying, I don't want my child to feel guilty. I don't want my child to have the burden of guilt that we discussed about. I want my child to be happy. Right? In former generations, it was about, I want my child to be a good Christian. I want my child to be a good American, to be a good communist, to be a good Nazi, to be a good fascist. We raised our children and we wanted them to fit into the ideology. In modern days, we don't want those big ideologies anymore, right? They didn't lead us to very good places. It's about individualism. My mother didn't want to raise me to be a good kibbutznik from the kibbutz, like her grandmother. She wanted just to be happy. But when we say that we want to raise a child who feels good, do we want to raise a child who is good to others, or a child that feels good? Because in previous generation, parents used guilt feelings to try and urge their kids to live up to their expectations, to be a good child. Today, I don't want my daughter to feel guilty because it's not a very pleasant emotion, right? And we want our babies to be happy and to feel good about themselves. So if in ancient times guilt was like society's whip, in our generation, people are sick of the leash. We're sick of the way guilt is used to tame us. We try to educate our children not to feel guilty. And we pay a big social price for that. I think we're only starting to realize what price we're going to pay for that. And I'll say that individuals aren't the only one who wish to avoid guilt feelings, and that states do it quite often as well. A few years ago, I was asked by a German newspaper to write an essay about guilt, and their leading question was, and I quote, "How can we overcome the guilt between Germany and Israel?" And the thing that really interested me was the assumption that we need to overcome the guilt between Israel and Germany. As if guilt was a flat tire that you have to fix, you have to change, in order to keep the car going fast enough, to keep the relationship going. But as a Jew, I see the German guilt not as an interfering factor in the relationship. I see the guilt as the factor that enables the relationship from the first place. I don't blame the current German generation for what their grandfathers did, but I expect to remember the collective past, to own it, to acknowledge it. As for collective guilt, I see it this way. If you take pride for being German, and there's a lot to be proud about, for Goethe and for Kant and for German philosophy and German literature and German football, then you can't avoid collective guilt either. There is no collective pride without collective guilt. You can't waive Kant and forget Himmler. And I think this is true for every collective identity, also for the Israeli identity. It's very tempting to shake off guilt, to say that the wrongdoing was committed by a government that I didn't vote to and which I resent. But guilt is essential. When we try to overcome it, we're missing something. Guilt is what motivates us to try and change the current situation. So if the occupation is done by the Israeli government and not by Ayelet, then Ayelet might not feel obligated to protest against it. The sense of responsibility that drives people to resist against wrongdoing is crucial. It's guilt that kicks us out from our comfortable sofas to the street to protest whatever it is we need to protest against. Anti-guilt movement is very powerful today. Perhaps it's a reaction to the guilt area that I described previously. But I think in the national level, collective guilt is what leads us to stand with others and to demand a change. In the individual level, guilt is essential for repairment attacks. In the literary aspect, guilt is required whenever you want to form complex and layered characters. And I'll get into guilty pleasures in a second, but I found a very interesting distinction between guilt and shame that I think it's worth to look at, especially in selfie generation, because there is a lot of shame today, but not guilt. And I'll talk about this distinction. You can see it in two tragedies by Sophocles. One is a very famous one, Oedipus. The second is Aias. Do you pronounce Aias in English? Aias, Ajax. I'll pronounce it in Hebrew. So, Aias was the enemy of Odysseus. And he was blinded by Athena, the goddess. He was blinded to think that a pack of sheep was Odysseus, his enemy, and his soldier. So at the beginning of the tragedy, he slaughters all his sheep. These are his sheep, because Athena can be quite brutal. He slaughters all his sheep, and he's so proud of killing Odysseus and his soldiers, and he's doing it in front of everyone in the island. And the tragedy begins when Athena takes back the madness. He's no longer blinded by the madness, and he realizes what he had done. He realizes that he acted like a complete fool in front of everyone. And he feels so ashamed for doing that. Now, that's a spoiler, that he kills himself. Now, if I ask you, what would have happened if he was alone on the island? If no one was watching? There was no witness for him slaughtering the sheep. Would he still commit suicide? Probably not, I think. Because his humiliation is driven by the fact that it was a public event, because he embarrassed himself in front of an audience. Oedipus is completely different. When we talk about Oedipus, when he finds out that he killed his father and slept with his mother, this is not shame. This is guilt. Guilt exists even if nobody else but me knows about what I did. It's very different from bias. We are ashamed when others see us in our weakness. We are guilty in front of ourselves. This is the developmental shift between the external I and between the internalized I. So Ayas is worried about his self-esteem, about his ego, about his image, about the damage he caused to himself when he killed his sheep. Oedipus, on the other hand, is not concerned about his ego and about the way he's seen by others. He's concerned about his own aggressiveness. He's concerned about the damage he caused to others, not to himself. With this optimistic notion of Oedipus and Ayas, I will shift to pleasure and to interesting relationship between pleasure and guilt. We can identify a few links between guilt and pleasure. Sometimes guilt is the alibi that enables us to keep the pleasure going, like a cover or the tax we pay in order to keep enjoying our sins. We use guilt as a defense. For example, a friend of mine who is always late. I'm told her that I'm going to bring this example here. I'm trying to educate her. So you're right now helping me educate my Israeli friend. She's always late, but then she comes in, and to be late in Israel, it's not 10, 15 minutes, which is here I know late. It's like an hour late, 2 hours late. And she comes in, but before you can say anything, she says, wow, I'm so sorry. This is so not okay. I'm terrible. I'm a terrible person. I'm so sorry. So she's doing such a good job feeling guilty and blaming herself that you can't say anything, okay? Her guilt is like her armor. She comes into the room covered with an armor of guilt. Nothing you can say, okay? And then she can keep enjoying this pleasure of, taking your time, having a long bath instead of a shower, walking instead of running. She can keep on enjoying her pleasure because her guilt is really brilliant. Sometimes the pleasure of guilt lies in the omnipotent sense of control that comes with it. To feel guilty about something means to feel responsible. I'll give you an example. If I'll say, I feel so guilty about Kanye and Kim getting a divorce, what would you think? What relations do you have to those two? Why do you feel guilty? Do you have any control over it? Did you contribute to it? Was it Kanye? Was it Kim? Who did you seduce? Right? You feel guilty about something means that you have a sense of control about it, that we have a sense of responsibility about it. And we all like the feeling of control. So even if I'm coming and I'm really upset and I say, I feel guilty, what I'm actually practicing, maintaining, is my sense of control over what's going on in my life. Because if I say, I feel so guilty about my child, I'm still maintaining the thought that I can control what's going on with my child in school, that I can affect it, that is within my hand to affect it. Giving away my guilt would be to give away the fantasy that I have, that if I just acted differently, that the entire world would be different. And perhaps the most interesting link between pleasure and guilt is the fact that guilt itself can be tightly connected to pleasure. Think about the sentence, I'm not supposed to do this. I'm really not supposed to do this. How tempting this sentence can sound. Think about the sentence, you've been a naughty boy, which is used by mothers, yes, but is also used quite frequently in porn. Because some people derive pleasure from being caught. Some people derive pleasure from feeling guilty. And some people is, we put them over there, but a lot of people. And I think the idea that there is something that we are not supposed to do You see it in the Bible. It goes all the way from Genesis, from the myth of creation. The idea that whatever it is that we were not supposed to do is exactly the thing that we want to do. Not because of the apple is not interesting, because it is forbidden. And the idea that getting caught, which is what fears us the most, right? We don't want to get caught. We never want to get caught. But when you go back to the story of Genesis, come on, he knew he'll get caught. This is God we're talking about, right? We know that we might get caught. And this potential of guilt is part of what gives us the thrill. And I think I will stop with this.
Thank you very much for this absolutely brilliant conversation about guilt and redemption and the pleasures of feeling guilty. And I'm sure we will have a lively discussion with many questions. Who would raise the first question, please? Seize the opportunity, because afterwards you will be feeling guilty because you didn't ask the question. So. Yes, please, Christian Seiler.
For me, spontaneously, thank you very much for your very nice and brilliant ideas. Behind every guilt is pain, the pain of not being loved. And of course, this pain can also have something to do with pleasure. But when I think about also my biography, I reached this moment of pain, where the guilt is just the verdict, yeah? I'm not loving you anymore. So, what do you think about that?
I think it's very powerful what you said, and I'll go to a myth that echoes it. I think if you go to Cain and Abel, which is the first time we have guilt not between man and God, which is the story of the Garden of Eden, but between one man and another man, then you're absolutely right. The first murder in the Bible, the first time one man kills another man, is when we have two brothers, Cain and Abel. They both give presents to their father, to God. And God prefers the present of one child over the present of the other child. He takes the present of one, and he neglects the present of the other. And I don't know how many of you have brothers or sisters, but whoever had brother and sisters know from inside this feeling we have when we feel that the parent prefers one child over the other, and the aggressiveness that comes, the hate that comes with this. But when Cain kills Abel, the hate and the aggressiveness are the product of a love that was given but not accepted, right? He gives, the present is like his love to God, and God doesn't see it, like our fathers and mothers don't always see us the way we want them to see us. And I very much agree that Cain's guilt for killing his brother is actually driven by this feeling of loss of love. And I quite agree that quite often we do terrible things, not because we're a psychopath, not because we're driven by some sort of evil, but really most of the terrible things people do are because of the loss of love. And I still find it interesting, I will still insist on another kind of guilt, which is the guilt of the story of the Garden of Eden, which I think is a bit different. Because man gets the entire garden to himself. The entire garden, all the trees he can eat, all the fruits he can eat. And then he's going to the one that he is not supposed to. And I think in this case, this is like the father or the mother that tells the child, but I gave you everything. Why are you still so full of complaints? Okay, and perhaps this is the guilt of wanting more than anyone could ever give us. Like there's this hole inside of us, and no matter how much love you pour inside, it will always be a bit empty. I hope I answered the question.
True enough. Of course, we forgot also the role of the snake in Genesis. You know, she was really mean, and she seduced them and promised them together be like God, discerning the difference between good and evil. And that's why also they tried to eat this green apple, and then the whole miserable history of mankind started, and we still try to get it back to the point where we never will end. Anyway, next questions, please. Markus Homm. And we have a microphone.
Martin, we were talking about Zwingli, and that's actually the Middle Ages, and I was wondering, I mean, if we think about the past, we have the impression people felt guilty all the time. There were so many reasons to be guilt-ridden. What do you think about today? Do we have people who are still very guilty, or would you say guilt is something which is something from the past?
I think it's a brilliant question, and I'm very occupied with it today. From being a mother and raising kids, and also I work in a locked ward of a youth hospital, so mental health hospital. And we have a lot of teenagers coming to the locked ward, and I'm very occupied with this question of guilt. How much from depression is because we feel guilty, because we feel that we're not good enough? This is the internalized guilt. And how much is it that our generation is sick of feeling guilty? Because I think if you use Google, I love Google. I love the wisdom of the crowds. I like to see what people look for in Google, because I think it tells you a lot about what people are interested in and what are the main questions that they're struggling with. And the main question today in Israel, I'd never Googled it in Switzerland, but the main question today is not how to raise a child who is a good person. The main question is how to raise a child that feels good about himself. We don't want our kids to feel guilty. We don't try to make them feel guilty if they did something bad to their classmates, because we're really busy in them feeling good in class. I rarely ask my daughter, she's 9, have you been good to other people today? I don't ask it. It sounds like an orthodox question. It sounds like a question that my grandmother would ask. And I think...
Could she answer it? Your daughter, could she answer this question?
If she was good to other people today?
Yeah, what would she say?
I think perhaps because she wasn't trained to think about it, she was trained to measure how fun, was today fun?
Okay.
That's the question.
I had a lot of fun with my peer group or so.
Yeah, it's really about, did I have fun?
Okay. Well, it's satisfying if it works, no?
I think the question, I'll give you an example. I talked to a friend that her child refused to dance with another child. The other child was very not popular, and they had a school ceremony, and the kids were joined into pairs, but it wasn't like a party. It was like a... And her child refused to dance with the most unpopular child because he didn't want to stand next to her. Nobody likes her, he didn't want to stand next to her. And she shared that with me. And I asked her, so what did you do? And she said, I didn't want him not to be loyal to what he feels. I didn't want him to have to conceal his feelings. I didn't want him to betray himself. I'm translating from the Hebrew. So I told him that he can choose if he wants to dance with someone or not. We own our body, we can choose, we want to dance. And I thought, yeah, but what about this girl that nobody wants to dance with? It's not just about having fun or reclaiming our body. It's also about this question of, but what about other people? And I feel this we sometimes forget.
Right. Next question, please. Yeah, back there.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, my first question was, how does all of this, how can you kind of expand it to international affairs? How do you see the role of guilt and pleasure on the, one could say, on a global scale, noting the kind of, the theme of the evening, or the topic that brings us here. And then while I was listening to your answer now, I was wondering, but it sounds like all of our society has been built on guilt. Like somehow society is structured on the way that we as humans, we function with the fuel of guilt. And now if this is gone, it sounds like the fuel we are functioning on is changing, meaning that society fundamentally will change very drastically, or has changed very drastically. And it would be lovely to hear your thoughts on, is that so, and what does it mean? Can we function as a community, as a nation, and or as a global order, knowing that we're no longer guilty?
It's a very good question. I don't know about pleasure in international affairs. That's an interesting topic for a talk, I think. Pleasure in international affairs. But I think about guilt, it's, for me at least, quite clear that while civilization, Freud said, is based on guilt, international affairs are based on shaking off historical guilt. Nobody wants to pay the price of colonization, right? Nobody wants to actually try and measure the price of being colonized or slavery, and to pay, like to try to redeem yourself in gold for what we did to other people. So I think when you look today, this is really not my topic, but I think if I look at, especially in Israel, for instance, we like to feel people are guilty about us. We don't like to feel guilty about others. I think it's true for relationships and for states. I think you can see how we try to shake off collective guilt in the political level because we don't want to pay the price that comes with guilt. And I think if you look at places like South Africa or like Australia, and these attempts to take responsibility years afterwards, to take responsibility and to acknowledge the damage that happened, it sometimes helps to repair a relationship that was torn. It sometimes can be healing.
Right. Next question, please. Sonia?
I was wondering, I do believe that...
1 second, we have a mic.
I do agree that the past generations have been driven by guilt, and that we kind of got tired of feeling guilty. We see it on all levels. But my question to you is there a humane society imaginable without guilt? Or can we be humane or as when we're not feeling guilty at all?
I think this comes back to your question and to what's next. If we had the guilt era and now we're tired of it, we're sick of it, we don't want to feel guilty anymore. I must say, I see it in the clinic quite often. People come and you just want to shake the guilt off. You don't want to change anything. You just want to talk about it and leave it behind it, really to take off the burden and not to think about the burden as a creative force for a change. And I think we pay a very heavy social price for that. But then again, I'm thinking we still have other sorts of fuel and motivator. The motivator I see today in Israeli society, and perhaps in America where I lived a bit, is the motivator of, I want me to be happy. And if I will work hard enough for being happy, then other people will benefit from it, right? We have this concept in economy. And it's working pretty well until the moment it doesn't anymore.
That's exactly the problem. And if we think about Nietzsche and his last man, he described, who said to the other one, we found happiness or even invented it. It was clear that was a society which never could work in a productive way because it was a world of avatars and dummies, and hopefully we don't end there. I have a question regarding your biography. When was the first point as a child you had the feeling of guilt and you were somehow helpless to cope with it, and what did your parents do about it?
Wow.
Wow.
Wow. I remember my sisters, when my sisters were born. I remember a lot of like...
Challenge?
Challenge is a word grown-ups use, but as a child you don't think about it as a challenge, right?
True.
As a child you think about it as a nightmare. And I think it was interesting because you feel guilty for being so upset for having sisters because they're twins. You feel guilty for hating them. And then you realize that you can't just go along hating them because, Cain and Abel, it didn't end up very well. You realize that you have to create a new balance in the family, and you have to create your own place in the world. So I started writing, actually, about the age that my sisters were old enough to be cute and to take all the place. This is one of the things that motivated me into writing as a young girl, because I thought, I can't kill them, so I have to find another way to find my place in the world. And hey, if I write story, then the God, which is the father and the mother, suddenly they're smiling and they find the time. So I think you see how this inner conflict, you have hate, you have love, you have guilt, and you have the way it pushes you to try and do something and create something. And sometimes you don't find a good solution, and you have to think about another one, and another one, and another one. Like, this is the journey.
True enough. So find your place in the world, and somehow your consciousness of guilt helps to promote that in a way. And if we generalize, every good writer is a guilty writer. Is that
Wow.
a little bit too much?
It's interesting.
I mean, we can check in the history of literature. Marcel Proust, for instance, and his mother relationship. Oh, that's fantastic for also psychologists, no? The amount of guilt and overcome guilt into literature and aesthetics, and so.
I think it's very good what you're saying, because right now you're making me think that if I'm doing a bad job with my kids, I'm actually preparing them to go out to the world, and like the guilt will motivate them. But I'm thinking, there's this beautiful quote by Romain Gary, the French author, and he talks about authors as always feeling claustrophobic inside their own skin. Like, you don't feel comfortable, you don't feel like you fully belong, you always feel a bit like an outsider.
As a writer?
As a person.
Okay.
I think, I came here today and I found myself being anxious before the talk, and I thought, it's funny, like, you're here and you're very nice, and
we love you all.
But the thing is that I thought it's amazing that no matter where I go, I can fly to Zurich, I can fly to different places, I will always have this uncomfortable feeling. And I think I'm starting to get friendly with this feeling, because I'm thinking, okay, you have this feeling, but this feeling is like being an outsider also makes you want to write. So they're connected to each other, I think.
Are you a religious person?
No.
No?
I don't believe in God.
Never? In earlier states, or?
Well, when my mother was hospitalized, we had a small talk, but it didn't give me what I wanted, so we ended the relationship. It's not...
I can understand that, but nevertheless, a punishing God is a wonderful source for feeling guilty, no?
But I think that's exactly the thing, right? This is Nietzsche. Even people who gave up the punishing God, they still have the punishing parent. They still have, it's inside of us. You don't need God. You have the mother, you have the father, you have the school teacher that thought that you're an idiot. You have somebody there that
Plenty of little gods.
Plenty of little gods. It's like an Indian shrine.
Oh, okay. Next question, please. Again, Christian. And then behind.
Important aspect of authoritarian systems, guilt and punishment. Because there is not central that people are happy, feel happy, but feel guilty.
That's why I think we got tired of guilt, because guilt was used to manipulate us, to control us, to dominate us for years. I talked about women in Vienna of the 19th century because you could really see how guilt was used. Women felt guilty for, actually this is not from Vienna of the 19th century, this is from a research made in Tel Aviv University 10 years ago, that female students, when they raise their hands to talk in class, describe this guilt feeling of, am I interrupting the class right now? Do I have something smart enough to say? Am I taking too much space? Okay, this is like the guilt of educating a girl in a more patriarchal society, when you feel guilty for you're not supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do that. And I think many governments use guilt to control citizens, because you don't need the cops outside. If I don't feel like a good citizen, a good communist, a good Christian, it's a very powerful instrument for social control. But it can also, it's power, but you can use, just as you can use fire to warm and you can use fire to burn. It's a power, it's how we use it. I'll say that today in Israel, for instance, we're protesting against what the government is doing right now. And we have now using guilt to unite. Because if I don't go to a demonstration, then my friends will say, what, you wanted to stay home and order takeaway and watch TV while our democracy is falling apart? We scold each other now. Whoever doesn't come to the demonstration on Saturday, we use the social norm, the panopticon. We use the eyes of others to push us into the street, and I think this is beautiful.
What will be the outcome of the current disruptions in Israel? Any predictions?
I'm not a prophet.
No.
I can say what I hope will be the outcomes. I think after a long time of people focusing in the individual life, in the bubble in Tel Aviv, we see people taking out to the streets and really fighting against the government to try and make the country more democratic. And I see it as something very beautiful, and I certainly hope and feel that we're going to win.
And it's a sign of democracy, applied democracy, these protests, no?
It's a sign of democracy, but it's a sign of democracy under danger, under huge danger. To make everyone cancel their Saturday night parties to go demonstrating, you need something very, very serious. So whenever I see someone who never goes out to protest in a demonstration, I'm happy on the one hand, because I'm saying, yay, you never come and you came, so it's a good thing. But I'm also very concerned, because I'm thinking, wow, if you're out now,
right,
it means that it's really serious.
Absolutely. I don't ask you about the outcome of the current world affairs. It's sinister enough, and we have other speakers who are obliged to deal with that at our institute, but it looks really black.
It comes back, I think, to your question about guilt in international affairs.
Exactly.
How guilty should we get in order to act in the world and not just to express our sympathies? One of the things I hate the most is to express my sympathies. I don't understand what people can do with my sympathy. I think
you are underestimating your...
My sympathy?
No, also your impact, your authority. So there's another job to do.
I think, again, it's about, do I feel, when we sit in front of the news and we say, wow, I feel so bad about whatever is going on there. Again, it's about sedative or creative. Am I saying it to feel good about myself as a moral human being, or am I actually doing something in the world? Does this guilt push me to action, or is it just a way, to signal my virtue as a person?
As a journalist, of course, you have then still other means and over-ego, the Über-Ich of Freud, to satisfy what is asked. Maybe a last question? Yes, here, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure how to formulate my question, but I find it surprising that we kind of said that guilt is something from the past, because I think in the past we were not feeling so much guilty about racism or sexism, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I guess French people didn't feel so guilty about occupying Algeria, right? And whereas now I feel like we feel more guilt, right? But I just wonder, and I think it's connected with what you said, right? With social norms, that now maybe the way guilt manifests is much less with parents telling you need to do this and that, but maybe more about telling you, look, this is how I feel, this is how I live, this is the unfairness I have, or I experience, and it still manifests, right? Or what do you think about that? Because for me, this was a mismatch with what I also see.
I think you made a very important distinction. When we feel guilty, it doesn't mean what we feel guilty about. So you're right that back then people felt guilty about everything, but perhaps not about the thing that you and I would describe as important, right? So I could feel terribly guilty for having a relationship before I get married, for instance. And I could commit suicide because my name was damaged because I kissed a boy. So I would feel guilty about things that you and I wouldn't agree today, but it still controlled us. And today, when you talk about the awareness for racism or for feminism, I think you're right that people are more aware, but I'm not sure I would call it guilt, because I think the norms change and it's beautiful. But I wonder about guilt. I wonder about how dominant is it today in our culture. I think we don't talk about it as much as we talk about our pleasures, that's for sure.
And another topic, of course, you experienced yourself when you were in America would be woke culture and the promotion of guilt back to history of hundreds of years. But this will be the next talk of Ayelet, and you have to feel guilty if you don't come within the next 2 years here to talk about that. And I will remind you constantly that this is still something to have to fulfill. So before we proceed to a gift, which hopefully makes you happy, mostly it works, not always. I don't tell now the story with the gift for Gerhard Schröder. This is already 8 years ago. I would like to have a quick look for the next events of the Institute. We have on 19th of April, Professor Markowitz, the famous German historian, about the benefits of federalism. We have the former Minister of Health of Germany, Jens Spahn. The situation is a little bit easier now also for him concerning Corona and other challenges. And this now will be very, very important and interesting. The Iranian German journalist Natalie Amiri about an absolutely horrible regime who treats many people and mostly women in the most terrible way and does not feel guilty at all. Mm-hmm. Then we have last event in the Literaturhaus Zürich with Tanja Maljarczuk. She also wrote a very interesting book. She comes from Ukraine, and she will, of course, like Sergei Shadan, whom we had here as a speaker too, tell experiences, what happens there. This is extremely tragic, and so you find this opportunity in the cozy event surroundings of the Zürcher Literaturhaus. Would be great if as many as possible would attend this discussion. I will do it with her. So, Ayelet, now we are almost at the end. And of course, we always think about a gift which makes somehow sense and is also, in a way, charming. That's not always so easy with Swiss visions of charm. But allow me to say this in a rather realistic way. But anyway, we found a beautiful blues. Swiss craftsmanship. You see, you look great. You always look great, but this is absolutely fantastic. I mean, I think also the color is good. Let's see, because we try different colors, not with you directly, but with your photograph. No, that's great. No, that your family will love you even more. And it's also this Swiss flower called Edelweiss. I mean, it's probably like kindergarten, a word you cannot translate. It's a beautiful flower, rare, and the quality is absolutely fantastic. So I tell you, it holds for at least 50 years. And if you don't wash this with 90 degrees, it will fit to you also for 50 years. Now, thank you very, very much again.
You really made me laugh.
Fantastic.